So the idea of Sokal Cubed is basically a question. Could we create spaces, or could we create university that is mostly about learning? Not other stuff, but learning. Could we create something that, some kind of spaces that will become the basis of anti-rivalrous economy? And that spaces that can spur innovation, that can spin off innovation, that can become a foundation of some kind of new economy that is closing all the loops, that is circular economy, that is built on totally different foundations, not the rivalrous foundations, but anti-rivalrous foundations. So why Sokal Cubed? Okay, it's basically a reaction to Sokal Squared with Hoax. That was a milestone moment from the last year, from in the culture wars moments, where there were the trio of activists for science, Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose. They wrote some 20 papers. They managed to get published submit and accepted 7 papers. And I guess published 4 papers in so-called what they call grievance studies, and it was a hoax based on Alan Sokal's original hoax, where he hoaxed an academic journal called Social Text, if I'm correct, and he kind of hoaxed. There was something about some critical theory combination with mathematics, but then he revealed that this is a hoax. Those 4 papers from Sokal Squared are kind of similar. It's kind of pranking the critical theory or postmodernism or gender studies. So basically what the Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose try to do is something like grievance studies. So it's like a study of a gender study. So kind of trying to contemplate like what they call some kind of, like, they call it, this is some kind of corruption of the academy, that where there is this ideological polarization, or ideological, kind of very narrow ideological push towards that endangers or treads on hard sciences, and so it's like kind of importing some kind of social justice theory or something, social justice activism into hard sciences, and they are trying to fight against it. So this is like Sokal Squared idea based again on the original Sokal hoax. So my idea is that I think those guys are a bit naive to think that they will make a dent into university or humanities, or what they call it, some kind of new religion trying to push some ideology into science, and they are kind of fighting against it, but I think they are a bit naive because they suppose somehow, or they try to imply that university or the academy is mostly about truth seeking or collective sense making, and it's about learning. So, but I would argue that the academy or education in general is not mostly about learning. It's mostly about something else. It's mostly about, let's say, climbing up a hierarchy. It's mostly about gaining status from certification, from diploma, that okay, I'm a graduate of a certain university, and most of the value comes actually from the act of graduation, from act of holding a certificate, a diploma, which it's called by economist sheepskin effect. So basically the certificates were before printed on sheepskin, so it's like sheepskin effect. So graduation or the last year of your studies is worth more than all the other years combined. So it's kind of strange, because mostly, like, yeah, education should be about learning. Like, you learn some practical skills, some practical vocation, and you can use it in your job, and this should be about the most of the value from education. So but most of the value, according to, for example, Brian Kaplan and his book from 2017, I think, it's called The Case Against Education, or from the book by two guys. One of them is Robin Hanson, the economist, which is, the book is called The Elephant in the Brain. They are kind of having a similar approach to various domains, from religion to education. And basically, these two books say that the most in this domain, like education, the most value comes from signaling. Signaling is a concept from biology originally. Signaling means that I have a certificate, and this certificate is a very strong signal that I graduated this school. It means that I'm diligent, I'm maybe intelligent, I'm able to work hard and to fulfill my duties. And also this is a certificate that I spent maybe 4 or 5 years together with other people from maybe privileged backgrounds who study at these elite schools, and so I'm interesting for my future employees just because of this social milieu, just because of this signaling value that this certificate bears. So, of course, most of the people forget almost everything what they have learned 10 years ago, 20 years ago. There is not much value, like, I don't know, don't remember much of calculus if I don't use it daily. I don't remember much of German because I haven't used it for 10 years. I have a certificate, I studied German, but it's not really useful for my future employees. If I don't revise, maybe for 3 months, I can get better, okay? But the idea is that education is not mostly about learning. So if the activist trio behind the Sokal Squared, they want to save the academy, they want to protect the science from the activist disciplines, what they call grievance studies, something like gender studies, fat studies, something like that, that they find corrosive towards science. Maybe we can, they call it some kind of religion, but maybe if we are more generous and good faith, based on good faith, we can call it, basically this is philosophy or humanities, or okay, maybe if they are crossing the domain from humanities to sciences and they want to criticize sciences, then it kind of becomes ideology. When you're crossing domains from religion to science, it's kind of ideology, which we know from the Soviet Union. There was this Lysenkoism or Lysenko kind of case where people had some pseudo-scientific ideas about agriculture, and actually people paid dearly for those stupid ideas. So there is a real threat of ideology, but I think what the trio seems to be very naive is that they think that actually the academy as a whole, or university as a whole, is about learning. Education is signaling. Maybe 80% of the value, according to Brian Kaplan, comes from signaling, but definitely 50% at least, and then some learning. So signaling, maybe 80% of the value, 20% learning. So the Sokal Cubed would be like kind of inverse hoax, where you would actually create a place that would be mostly about learning, not mostly about signaling. The universities are here since, I don't know, maybe a couple of 100 years ago, maybe even up to 1,000 years ago. But so according to maybe this Lindy effect, there will be another 1,000 years with us, another 1,000 years into the future with us. Maybe not. Maybe there is something radical happening because of YouTube, because of some kind of distributed collective sense-making intelligence. Maybe it might be the case, but I would argue that universities are these archaic structures of sense making, of building a dominance hierarchy or a prestige hierarchy. There are two different hierarchies based on, let's say, some Aristotle, the teacher, or the most famous teacher who taught Marcus Aurelius, was it? No, Alexander the Great. So Aristotle, the teacher of Alexander the Great, you imagine you have some amazing great professor, he's on the top of the prestige hierarchy at some very elite university, and you just want to be his disciple or his student or his assistant or something like that. So this is this is the status quo of the university or the academia, and of course it has a lot of value to build societies on these kind of structures, but then there are some alternatives to it, more of a fluid, distributed sense-making, collective intelligence based on some independent thinkers that are kind of thinking from first principles from various perspectives, and then you can combine different paradigms and you can kind of create some kind of collective sense making or cluster thinking from various perspectives, various ideas, without one ideology becoming too dominant and too because that might become counterproductive or detrimental to scientific progress. So Sokal Cubed, is hoaxing the current state of gender studies or grievance studies, what they call other disciplines or activist disciplines. Good for them, but I think the trio of activists who released these papers of Sokal Cubed papers or grievance studies papers, they are a bit too naive into thinking that actually academia is mostly about learning and truth-seeking or collective sense-making, we can call it. The really big task now is to create institutions, or maybe not even institutions, just places that will be mostly about learning and mostly about collective sense-making. There are some real-world precursors of these, maybe your local makerspace, your local Fab Lab, Santa Fe Institute that created complexity science and that allowed scientists from various disciplines to genuinely interact and collaborate on really novel thinking. There is this Center for Documentation of culture or something, another center in Mexico. So Santa Fe Institute is in New Mexico, but this is another example, but this one is from the 60s. Ivan Illich co-founded this center, CDOC, I think it's called. So there's maybe another precursor or example of like a place where you want. Ivan Illich is the guy who coined terms such as counterproductivity or deschooling. So he kind of figured out that schools are maybe making us a bit stupid sometimes. So, and if you consider what the ideas behind Peter Thiel's 0 to 1, actually the ideas behind it are influenced by René Girard and his theory of scapegoat. It's a theory of mimetic theory of how people are competing against each other, because René Girard was teaching at Stanford when Peter Thiel was there. There is another guy I follow kind of closely, which is very influenced by René Girard. Is called Jean-Pierre Dupuy, and he's a big influence on Slavoj Žižek as well. And Jean-Pierre Dupuy was a friend of René Girard, and he was also a friend of Ivan Illich. So it's kind of interesting that people from quite a different political backgrounds, me including myself, I'm left-leaning, Peter Thiel is libertarian-leaning or something like that, but they are coming from one theory which is called like how actually people are counterproductively competing against each other. So Peter Thiel has this theory like universities, what are they good for? well, mostly he thinks it's something like an insurance policy, or it's something like a nightclub, like exclusive nightclub dynamics, because there are like a lot of people going there, partying and learning something, okay, getting to know each other, but it's really exclusive. So if you have a Harvard in a country of 300, I don't know, 20 million people, like the USA, why would you just have like 2,000 graduates a year, or like a couple of thousand graduates a year? Why not open it to everyone if it's the best education? Of course, the value from the education comes from the exclusivity. And especially Peter Thiel is very cynical and very critical of, like, let's say, the MBA programs, the graduates there, he calls them, or the environment where they grow, it's some kind of like hothouse of the most trendiest ideas. So they usually like really focus on industries that are